Welcome to WooEnglish. In this story, you'll learn English through clear and simple sentences. Feel free to leave comments and share your thoughts. If you enjoy the story, please press the like button to support us. It really helps. This story is designed to help you improve your English while you enjoy an inspiring tale about Napoleon Bonaparte. His journey offers valuable lessons about leadership, ambition, and the impact of one's actions. However, we do not encourage or glorify any actions in the story. Let's begin the journey together. Chapter 1. The Corsican Boy. In the year 1769, on a small and rugged island in the Mediterranean Sea, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born. The island was called Corsica, a place of wild mountains, deep forests, and clear blue seas. The people of Corsica were proud and independent, with a strong love for their land. They were not wealthy, but they were tough and full of spirit. This was the world into which Napoleon entered. A world that would shape the young boy's mind and dreams. Napoleon was the second of 8 children in the Bonaparte family. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer, and his mother, Letizia, was a strong and determined woman. The Bonaparte family lived in the town of Ajaccio, in a modest home. They were not rich, but they held their heads high. Carlo often told stories of the family's noble heritage, and these stories filled young Napoleon's imagination with thoughts of honor, glory, and a better life. From an early age, Napoleon showed signs of being different from other children. He was small and thin, but his eyes were bright, and his mind was sharp. He spent hours alone, reading books and dreaming of great adventures. His favorite stories were about heroes and warriors, men who had changed the world with their courage and intelligence. He loved to listen to the tales of the ancient Romans and Greeks, imagining himself as one of their mighty leaders. Despite his love for books, Napoleon was not always well-behaved. He had a fiery temper and often fought with his older brother, Joseph. Sometimes he would get so angry that he would run off into the hills, where he would sit for hours, thinking and planning his next move. But even in his anger, there was a sense of purpose. Napoleon was determined to be something more than just a poor boy from Corsica. Life in Corsica was not easy. The island had been under the rule of the French for only a few years, and many Corsicans were unhappy about it. There were frequent clashes between the local people and the French soldiers stationed there. Napoleon's family was caught in the middle of this conflict. Carlo Bonaparte supported the French, hoping that they would bring peace and prosperity to the island. But many of their neighbors did not agree, and this made life difficult for the Bonapartes. As Napoleon grew older, his father decided that the best way to secure a bright future for his son was through education. Carlo used his connections to get Napoleon a place at a prestigious military school in France. This was a great opportunity, but it meant that Napoleon would have to leave his family and his beloved island behind. At the age of 9, Napoleon boarded a ship bound for the French mainland. The journey was long and difficult, and for the first time, Napoleon felt the pain of being alone. He missed his family, his mother's comforting presence, and the familiar sights and sounds of Corsica. But deep down, he knew that this was the beginning of something important. He was determined to make the most of this opportunity, to prove himself worthy of the sacrifices his family had made. When Napoleon arrived at the military school, He was shocked by how different everything was. The school was in Brienne-le-Château, a town far from the warm Mediterranean climate he was used to. The buildings were large and cold, and the other boys were all from wealthy families. They spoke perfect French, while Napoleon's French was heavily accented with Corsican, which made him feel out of place. The other students teased him for his accent and his small size, calling him the little Corsican. But Napoleon did not let their words break his spirit. Instead, he worked harder than anyone else, spending long hours studying and practicing his military drills. Despite the challenges, Napoleon excelled at the school. He was particularly good at mathematics, which was essential for becoming an artillery officer. He also studied history, geography, and the tactics of famous military leaders. Napoleon admired the great generals of the past, and he began to dream of one day leading his own army to victory. But it wasn't just academics that set Napoleon apart. He had a fierce determination that the teachers could not ignore. While the other boys spent their free time playing games, Napoleon often walked alone, thinking deeply about the world and his place in it. He began to see himself as someone destined for greatness, someone who would rise above the circumstances of his birth. Over the years, Napoleon's hard work paid off. He moved up in his class rankings and earned the respect of some of his teachers. They began to see that this small, determined boy from Corsica had the potential to do great things. But despite his successes, Napoleon never forgot where he came from. He remained proud of his Corsican heritage, even as he learned to navigate the complexities of French society. One day, when Napoleon was about 15 years old, he received news that his father had died of stomach cancer. This was a heavy blow for the young boy. Carlo had been his strongest supporter, and now he was gone. But Napoleon did not let grief overwhelm him. Instead, he became even more determined to succeed. He knew that his family was depending on him, and he was determined to make them proud. Napoleon's time at the military, school was coming to an end, and he had to decide what to do next. Most of his classmates were planning to join the French army as officers, but Napoleon's path was not so clear. As a Corsican, he still felt like an outsider in France, but he also knew that the military offered the best chance for him to achieve his dreams. In the end, Napoleon decided to continue his studies at the École Militaire in Paris, a prestigious military academy where he would train to become an artillery officer. This was a crucial decision, one that would set him on the path to greatness. The young boy from Corsica was about to step into a much larger world, one filled with challenges and opportunities. And with each step, Napoleon's determination grew stronger. As Napoleon prepared to leave Brienne-le-Château, he looked back on his years at the school. He had faced many challenges, but he had also learned a great deal. He was no longer just the little Corsican boy. He was becoming a man with a vision, a man who was ready to take on the world. With his bags packed and his mind filled with dreams, Napoleon set off for Paris. He was still small in stature, but his spirit was growing larger with each passing day. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Napoleon Bonaparte was ready to make his mark on history. Chapter 2. A Star in the Military School. Napoleon Bonaparte's journey from the small, rugged island of Corsica had brought him to the heart of France. At just 9 years old, he had left behind his family, his childhood, and the only world he had ever known. Now, as a teenager, he found himself in a place that was as different from Corsica as night is from day. He was a student at the École Militaire, one of the most prestigious military academies in France. This was a world of discipline, ambition, and high expectations. A world where only the best could thrive. From the moment Napoleon arrived at the academy, he felt like an outsider. The other students were the sons of noblemen and wealthy families, dressed in fine clothes and speaking perfect French. Napoleon, on the other hand, was from a modest background. His accent was thick with the sounds of Corsica, and his clothes, though neat, were simple. The other boys noticed these differences right away, and some of them were not kind. "Who's the little Corsican?" they would whisper as Napoleon passed by. "Does he even know how to hold a sword?" But Napoleon was not easily discouraged. He had faced challenges before, and he knew how to handle them. Instead of letting their words hurt him, he used them as fuel. He was determined to prove that he belonged, that he was just as capable, if not more so, than any of them. The life of a cadet at the École Militaire was not easy. The days were long and filled with rigorous training. There were classes in mathematics, history, geography, and, of course, military tactics. The students learned how to march in formation, how to handle weapons, and how to think like soldiers. The instructors were strict, and they expected nothing less than perfection. At first, Napoleon struggled. The French spoken at the academy was more formal and sophisticated than what he was used to. He often found himself stumbling over words or not understanding the lessons as quickly as his classmates. The physical training was also tough. Although Napoleon was strong for his size, he was smaller and lighter than most of the other boys. He had to push himself harder to keep up. But Napoleon had something that set him apart, an unbreakable will. He refused to be defeated by these challenges. Every evening, while the other boys relaxed or wrote letters home, Napoleon would stay up late, studying by candlelight. He would read and reread his textbooks, practice his French, and go over his lessons until he understood them perfectly. He knew that knowledge was power, and he was determined to master every subject. Over time, Napoleon's hard work began to pay off. His instructors noticed that he had a sharp mind, especially for mathematics and military strategy. He had a natural ability to solve complex problems, to see patterns where others saw confusion. He quickly became one of the top students in his class, earning the respect of his teachers. But with this success came new challenges. Some of his classmates resented him for it. They were used to being the best, and they did not like being outshone by a boy from Corsica. "Why do you work so hard, Bonaparte?" one of them asked one day, his voice full of jealousy. "You'll never be more than a poor officer, even if you do well here." Napoleon looked at him calmly. "I work hard because I have dreams," he replied. "Dreams that go beyond this school. If you don't want to work, that's your choice. But don't stand in the way of those who do." Napoleon's confidence was growing. He began to see that his future was not limited by where he came from, but by how hard he was willing to work and how much he was willing to learn. The academy, once a place of struggle, became a place of opportunity. He threw himself into his studies, particularly in the areas of artillery and strategy. He learned everything he could about the great battles of history, the tactics of famous generals, and the art of war. He understood that to command, one must first know how to follow, and to lead, one must first know how to plan. The environment at the academy was both demanding and competitive. The students were constantly being tested, both mentally and physically. There were drills, exams, and mock battles designed to push them to their limits. Napoleon thrived in this environment. He was not the strongest or the fastest, but he was the most determined. He understood that success in the military was not just about physical strength. It was about intelligence, strategy, and the ability to think quickly under pressure. One day, the academy held a major exercise, a mock battle that would test the cadets' ability to command troops in a simulated war. The cadets were divided into teams, and each team was given a different role in the battle. Napoleon was placed in charge of the artillery, responsible for positioning the cannons and directing their fire. This was his chance to show what he had learned. The mock battle was intense. The cadets moved across the fields, shouting orders and trying to outmaneuver each other. Napoleon's team was smaller and less experienced, but he quickly took control. He positioned the cannons on a hill, giving them a clear view of the battlefield. Then, using his knowledge of mathematics, he calculated the angles and distances needed to hit the opposing team's positions. His team fired with precision, disrupting the enemy's advance and turning the tide of the battle. When the exercise was over, the instructors were impressed. Napoleon's team had won, largely because of his leadership and strategic thinking. For the first time, the other cadets began to see him not just as the little Corsican, but as a true leader. He had shown them that size and background did not matter as much as intelligence and determination. As the months went by, Napoleon continued to excel. He was no longer just another student. He was becoming a star at the academy. But with his success came a new challenge. He was still young, and the pressures of leadership were heavy. He knew that to achieve his dreams, he had to keep pushing himself, to keep learning, and to never become complacent. Napoleon also began to realize that his time at the academy was preparing him for something much larger. He was no longer just studying to pass exams or to impress his teachers. He was preparing for a life of leadership, a life that would take him far beyond the walls of the academy. He began to see himself not just as a cadet, but as a future leader of men, someone who could change the world. As Napoleon neared the end of his time at the École Militaire, he looked back on the years he had spent there. He had arrived as a small, uncertain boy from Corsica, unsure of his place in this new world. But now, he was leaving as a young man with a clear sense of purpose. He knew that his journey was just beginning, but he was ready for whatever came next. Napoleon's time at the military academy had taught him many things: discipline, strategy, leadership, and most importantly, the power of determination. He had learned that success was not about where you came from, but about how hard you were willing to work and how much you were willing to learn. As he left the academy, he carried these lessons with him, ready to face the challenges of the future. Chapter 3: The Revolution and Opportunity. In the late 1780s, France was a country on the brink of change. The air was thick with tension as the old ways of life were being challenged by new ideas. The French Revolution was about to begin, a period of great turmoil and transformation that would shake the country to its very foundations. For many, it was a time of fear and uncertainty. But for a young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, it was a time of great opportunity. Napoleon was in his early 20s, a lieutenant in the French army, when the revolution began in 1789. He had just completed his training at the École Militaire and was eager to prove himself. But the army he served in was not the same as it had been a few years earlier. The revolution had brought chaos and confusion to the military, as it had to every other part of French society. Officers who had once been powerful found themselves losing their positions, while new leaders emerged from the ranks of ordinary soldiers. It was a time when the old rules no longer applied, and Napoleon quickly realized that this could work in his favor. As the revolution spread, the streets of Paris became scenes of great violence and unrest. The people were angry at the king, angry at the nobles, and angry at the injustice they had suffered for so long. Crowds gathered in the streets, demanding change. The sound of gunfire and the sight of blood were common as the revolutionaries clashed with the forces loyal to the monarchy. But amidst this chaos, Napoleon saw his chance. He was sent to Corsica, his homeland, to help defend the island during this turbulent time. However, the situation in Corsica was as unstable as it was in the rest of France. Factions were fighting for control, and the Bonaparte family found themselves in a difficult position. Although Napoleon had once been proud of his Corsican heritage, he now saw that his future was tied to France, not Corsica. The island was too small for his ambitions, and the local leaders did not appreciate his talents. It was during this time that Napoleon made a difficult decision. He chose to leave Corsica and align himself fully with the French cause. This decision marked a turning point in his life. He realized that his loyalty was not to a place, but to the ideals of the revolution, ideals of equality, liberty, and fraternity. These ideals, however, were often overshadowed by the brutal realities of the time. Napoleon's decision to embrace the revolution opened new doors for him. He returned to France and was given command of a small artillery unit. It was a modest position, but it was also a chance to prove himself. And prove himself he did. In 1793, Napoleon was sent to the city of Toulon, which had fallen into the hands of royalists who opposed the revolution. The situation was dire, and the French army was struggling to recapture the city. The royalists had the support of the British Navy, making the task even more difficult. But Napoleon saw an opportunity where others saw only a problem. Napoleon carefully studied the situation in Toulon. He noticed that the French forces were attacking the city from the wrong positions. The British ships in the harbor provided a strong defense. But Napoleon realized that if the French could capture a nearby hill, they could place their cannons there and force the British to retreat. It was a simple idea, but it required boldness and precise execution. He presented his plan to his superiors, who were initially skeptical. After all, he was still a young and relatively unknown officer. But Napoleon was confident in his strategy, and his conviction eventually persuaded them to give him a chance. Under Napoleon's direction, the French troops moved their cannons to the hill overlooking the harbor. The battle that followed was fierce, with both sides fighting desperately for control. The noise of cannon fire echoed across the city, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Napoleon himself was in the thick of the action, directing his men with calm precision. The plan worked. The British, realizing that they could no longer hold the city, began to withdraw their forces. Without their support, the Royalists were quickly defeated. Toulon fell back into the hands of the revolutionaries, and Napoleon was hailed as a hero. It was his first major victory, and it brought him the recognition he had long desired. News of Napoleon's success in Toulon spread quickly. In a time when many were losing faith in the revolution, his victory was a rare moment of hope. He was promoted to brigadier general, a remarkable achievement for someone so young. But more than that, he had shown that he was not just another officer. He was a leader who could change the course of events with his intelligence and courage. As the revolution continued, Napoleon's star continued to rise. He was given more responsibilities and more opportunities to prove himself. Each victory brought him closer to the position of power he sought. But Napoleon was not content with simply following orders. He was always looking for ways to advance his own ambitions. He understood that the revolution was a double-edged sword. While it had created chaos, it had also created opportunities for those who were bold enough to seize them. Yet, the revolution was also a time of great danger. The political landscape in France was constantly shifting, and alliances were fragile. The guillotine, a symbol of the revolution's more violent side, claimed the lives of many, including some of Napoleon's former allies. He knew that his position was not secure, that his rise could be as swift as his fall. But instead of being paralyzed by fear, Napoleon used the instability to his advantage. He maneuvered through the treacherous political waters with skill, making the right friends and avoiding the wrong enemies. By the time the revolution began to wind down, Napoleon had established himself as one of the most promising military leaders in France. He had taken advantage of the opportunities that the revolution offered, turning chaos into a ladder that he could climb. His success was not just the result of luck, it was the result of his relentless drive, his sharp mind, and his ability to see possibilities where others saw only problems. As the revolution gave way to a new order, Napoleon found himself in a position to shape that order. The young lieutenant from Corsica had risen through the ranks, not because of his birthright, but because of his talents and ambition. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a man with a vision for the future, a future where he would play a central role. The French Revolution was a time of great upheaval, a time when the old world was swept away to make room for something new. For many, it was a time of loss and fear. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, it was a time of opportunity, a time when he could rise above the chaos and carve out a place for himself in history. As he looked back on those years, Napoleon understood that the revolution had shaped him just as much as he had shaped it. It had given him the chance to prove himself, to rise from obscurity to prominence. And now, as France stood on the brink of a new era, Napoleon was ready to take the next step in his extraordinary journey. Chapter 4: The Italian Campaign. The year was 1796, and Europe was at war. The French Revolution had not only changed France, it had also set the continent ablaze with conflict. Amidst this turmoil, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte was about to embark on a campaign that would make him a legend. His destination: Italy. At just 26 years old, Napoleon was given command of the French army of Italy. It was not a prestigious appointment at first glance. The army was poorly equipped, and the soldiers were tired and hungry. They had little hope of success, and even less faith in their new commander. But Napoleon saw potential where others saw only problems. He knew that this was his chance to prove himself on the grand stage of history. As Napoleon took command, he wasted no time in addressing his troops. His voice was strong and confident as he spoke to them, not as a superior, but as a fellow soldier. "Soldiers," he began, "you are poorly fed and almost naked. The government owes you much, but it can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage in the midst of these rocks have been admirable, but they bring you no glory, no fame. I want to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There, you will find honor, glory, and wealth. Will you follow me?" The soldiers, inspired by Napoleon's words, felt a renewed sense of purpose. They saw in him not just a leader, but someone who believed in them, someone who could lead them to victory. And so, with spirits lifted, they began their march into Italy. The Italian campaign was not just a series of battles. It was a test of Napoleon's strategic genius. The first challenge came at the Battle of Montenotte, where the French forces faced the Austrian army. The Austrians were confident, believing they could easily defeat the French. But Napoleon had a different plan. He carefully studied the terrain and the movements of the enemy. Then, in a bold move, he divided his forces, sending one part to distract the Austrians, while the other attacked from an unexpected direction. The battle was fierce, with cannon fire echoing across the hills and the clash of swords ringing in the air. But Napoleon's strategy worked perfectly. The Austrians, caught off guard, were forced to retreat. It was a stunning victory, and it marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. News of the victory at Montenotte spread quickly, and Napoleon's reputation began to grow. But he was not content with just one success. He knew that to truly change the course of the war, he needed to keep the momentum going. And so, he led his army from one battle to the next, each time using his intelligence and boldness to outmaneuver the enemy. At the Battle of Lodi, Napoleon faced a challenging situation. The Austrian army was well defended on the opposite side of a river, with a single bridge connecting the two sides. The enemy's cannons were positioned to destroy anyone who tried to cross. But Napoleon, with his sharp mind and unshakable confidence, saw an opportunity. He ordered his soldiers to advance across the bridge despite the heavy fire. The soldiers hesitated at first, seeing the danger ahead. But Napoleon, leading from the front, charged onto the bridge himself. His courage inspired his men, and they followed him without hesitation. The scene was chaotic, with smoke filling the air and the sound of musket fire all around. But under Napoleon's leadership, the French soldiers pressed forward, overwhelming the Austrian defenses and securing another victory. The Battle of Lodi became legendary, and it was here that Napoleon earned the nickname the Little Corporal from his troops. It was a term of endearment, a recognition of his bravery and his willingness to fight alongside his men. The soldiers admired him not just for his victories, but for the way he led them, with intelligence, with courage, and with an understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. As the campaign continued, Napoleon's confidence grew. He began to see himself as someone destined for greatness, someone who could shape the future of Europe. But this confidence was not just about his own abilities. It was also about his belief in his soldiers. He knew that with their support, he could achieve anything. One of the most significant battles of the Italian campaign was the Battle of Arcole. The Austrians were determined to stop Napoleon, and they set up a strong defensive position near the town of Arcole, with a bridge over the river providing the key to their defenses. Napoleon knew that to win, he had to take that bridge. The battle was intense and brutal. The French forces charged the bridge multiple times, but each time they were pushed back by the relentless Austrian fire. The situation seemed hopeless, but Napoleon refused to give up. In a moment of sheer determination, he grabbed a flag and ran towards the bridge himself, rallying his men with his courage. For a moment, it seemed like they might succeed. But the Austrian fire was too strong, and Napoleon was forced to retreat. Yet even in retreat, his leadership shone through. He regrouped his forces, planned a new attack, and, after hours of fighting, the French finally broke through. The Austrians were defeated, and the bridge was theirs. The victory at Arcole was hard won, but it was also a turning point. It showed that Napoleon was not just a commander. He was a leader who could inspire his men to achieve the impossible. The soldiers who had once been doubtful of their young general now believed in him completely. They saw in him a man who could turn the tide of battle with his mind, his courage, and his unbreakable spirit. As the Italian campaign came to an end, Napoleon had transformed the French army of Italy from a struggling, demoralized force into a powerful, victorious machine. He had led them through countless battles, each one more challenging than the last, and had emerged not just as a hero, but as a symbol of what was possible. But Napoleon's success in Italy was more than just a series of military victories. It was a demonstration of what could be achieved with vision, determination, and a willingness to take risks. The campaign had shown that Napoleon was not just a soldier, but a strategist, a leader, and a man of extraordinary talent. As he prepared to return to France, Napoleon knew that this was just the beginning. The Italian campaign had made him a star, but it had also given him a taste of the power he could wield. The young general who had once been an outsider, who had struggled to find his place in the world, was now a force to be reckoned with. The Italian campaign had been a test of Napoleon's abilities, a challenge that he had met with brilliance and determination. It was the first step on a journey that would take him to the heights of power. And it was a journey that had only just begun. With his head held high and his heart full of ambition, Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. The world was about to see the full extent of his genius, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. Love and Power. In the spring of 1796, as Napoleon Bonaparte's star was rising with his successes in the Italian campaign, another aspect of his life was unfolding, a story of love, passion, and complexity. This is the story of Napoleon and Josephine, a relationship that would shape not only his personal life, but also his ambitions and his destiny. Josephine de Beauharnais was a widow with 2 children when she met Napoleon. She was 6 years older than him, a woman of grace and charm who had already seen much of life's hardships. Born in the Caribbean, Josephine had moved to France and married a nobleman who was executed during the Reign of Terror. Left alone and nearly destitute, she had managed to navigate the treacherous waters of Parisian society with skill and resilience. Napoleon first encountered Josephine at a social gathering in Paris. At that time, he was still a young general, ambitious, but not yet the powerful figure he would become. Josephine, on the other hand, was already well connected in Parisian circles, known for her beauty, her gentle manner, and her ability to win the favor of influential people. It was said that she had a way of making everyone feel at ease, a quality that had helped her survive the dangers of revolutionary France. From the moment Napoleon met Josephine, he was captivated by her. She was different from the women he had known before, older, more experienced, and with a mysterious aura that drew him in. She was not immediately impressed by him. She saw him as a rough, ambitious soldier, far removed from the refined gentleman she was used to. But Napoleon was not one to give up easily. He pursued her with the same determination that he applied to his military campaigns. Napoleon wrote passionate letters to Josephine, pouring out his feelings in a way that was both intense and overwhelming. He called her "my sweet Josephine," and spoke of his deep desire to be with her, even when he was away in the battlefield. His words were filled with emotion, reflecting the depth of his love and the intensity of his character. For Napoleon, love was not a gentle, easy thing. It was a force as powerful as war, something that consumed him completely. Josephine, though flattered by Napoleon's attention, was more cautious. She had lived through the dangers of the Revolution and knew that life could change in an instant. She was also aware of Napoleon's growing power and what it could mean for her. Marrying him could secure her future, but it would also tie her to a man who was unpredictable and driven by enormous ambitions. Despite her reservations, Josephine agreed to marry Napoleon. Their wedding took place on March 9, 1796, in a small, private ceremony. Napoleon was overjoyed, but the marriage was far from simple. Josephine, while affectionate, did not share the same intense passion that Napoleon felt. She was a practical woman, one who had learned to survive by keeping her emotions in check. For Napoleon, this was difficult to understand. He wanted all of her love, all of her attention, and when he did not receive it, he often felt frustrated and hurt. As Napoleon continued his military campaigns in Italy, their marriage faced its first tests. Napoleon was often away, leading his armies to victory, while Josephine remained in Paris, surrounded by the intrigues of society. Napoleon's letters to her became more desperate, filled with longing and jealousy. He worried that she might be unfaithful, that she might not love him as much as he loved her. Josephine, for her part, struggled with the demands of being the wife of a rising military leader. She was not used to the intensity of Napoleon's emotions or the sacrifices required by his career. She enjoyed the pleasures of Parisian life and was not ready to give them up completely. There were rumors that she had taken lovers, rumors that reached Napoleon and fueled his insecurities. Their relationship was a stormy one, marked by moments of deep love and moments of painful misunderstanding. Napoleon's love for Josephine was genuine, but it was also possessive and demanding. He wanted her to be everything to him, to fill the voids left by his intense ambition and the loneliness of command. But Josephine could not be that person, at least not in the way Napoleon wanted. Despite these challenges, there were also moments of tenderness and connection between them. When Napoleon returned to Paris after his victories in Italy, he was greeted as a hero. Josephine was there to meet him, and for a time, they were happy together. Napoleon showered her with gifts, including the Château de Malmaison, a beautiful estate near Paris where they could escape from the pressures of public life. At Malmaison, they spent time together, enjoying the gardens and the quiet beauty of the countryside. Josephine, with her love of nature, transformed the estate into a paradise of rare plants and exotic flowers. For a while, it seemed as though they had found a balance, a way to be together that allowed them both to be themselves. But the peace was always temporary. Napoleon's ambitions continued to grow, and with them, the demands on his time and energy. He was constantly planning, strategizing, and leading his armies in battles across Europe. Josephine, meanwhile, became more involved in the social life of Paris, where she was admired and sought after by many. The strain of their separate lives began to take its toll. Napoleon's letters became less frequent, and when they did come, they were often filled with reproach. Josephine, feeling the distance between them, became more guarded, more independent. She loved Napoleon, but she also knew that she could not change who he was or what he wanted. Their marriage, like their lives, was marked by both love and power, two forces that often pulled them in different directions. Napoleon needed Josephine as a partner, as someone who could stand by his side as he rose to power. But he also needed her as a source of emotional support, as someone who could love him unconditionally. Josephine, on the other hand, needed stability and security, things that were hard to find in the whirlwind of Napoleon's life. As the years passed, the pressures on their marriage increased. Napoleon's rise to power brought new challenges and new responsibilities. He was no longer just a general. He was a ruler, a man who would one day be emperor. Josephine, though still devoted to him, struggled with the demands of her new role. She had to navigate the complexities of court life, the expectations of being the wife of one of the most powerful men in the world. Despite these challenges, there was a bond between Napoleon and Josephine that endured. They were two people who, despite their differences, had shared a journey through some of the most extraordinary times in history. Their love was not perfect, but it was real, shaped by the circumstances of their lives and the choices they had made. In the end, Napoleon's love for Josephine was both his strength and his weakness. It drove him to achieve great things, but it also revealed the vulnerabilities of his character. He was a man who could conquer nations, but he struggled to conquer his own heart. Josephine, for her part, remained a complex figure, a woman who had survived the revolution, who had loved and been loved by one of history's most powerful men, but who had also paid a price for that love. Her story, like Napoleon's, was one of both triumph and tragedy, a reflection of the times in which they lived and the choices they made. As the chapter of their love story drew to a close, both Napoleon and Josephine knew that their relationship had shaped them in ways they could not have imagined. It had been a journey of passion, power, and complexity, one that would leave its mark on both of them and on the world they helped to shape. Chapter 6: The Egyptian Adventure. In the year 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte embarked on one of the most ambitious and daring campaigns of his career. His destination was Egypt, a land of ancient mysteries and vast deserts, far from the battlefields of Europe. The idea of conquering Egypt was bold and full of risks, but for Napoleon, it was an opportunity to extend his influence beyond Europe and to challenge the power of the British Empire in the Middle East. This was not just a military campaign. It was an adventure into the unknown. As the French fleet sailed across the Mediterranean, the soldiers on board were filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. They were leaving behind the familiar shores of Europe for a place that was, to most of them, completely foreign. Napoleon, however, was full of confidence. He had studied Egypt's history and culture, and he believed that by conquering this ancient land, he could create a new empire that would rival those of the past. When the fleet finally arrived on the Egyptian coast, the soldiers were struck by the strangeness of the land before them. The sun was blindingly bright, and the heat was intense. The landscape was vast and empty, with endless stretches of sand and the occasional palm tree breaking the horizon. In the distance, the soldiers could see the towering pyramids, ancient monuments that seemed to watch over the desert like silent sentinels. Napoleon, ever the strategist, wasted no time in organizing his forces. He knew that in this harsh environment, discipline and careful planning would be essential. The French army began its march into the interior of Egypt, moving towards the city of Cairo. The journey was grueling. The soldiers struggled with the extreme heat, the lack of water, and the unfamiliar terrain. The desert seemed endless, and the vast emptiness around them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. As they marched, the soldiers encountered new and strange sights. The Nile River, with its fertile banks, provided a sharp contrast to the dry desert. The villages they passed were unlike anything they had seen before, with houses made of mud bricks and people dressed in flowing robes. The French soldiers were fascinated by the differences in culture and lifestyle, but they also felt a sense of unease. They were strangers in a strange land, and the challenges they faced were unlike any they had encountered before. The first major battle of the campaign took place near the town of Shubra Kit. The French forces, though tired from their march, were well prepared under Napoleon's leadership. They faced the Mamelukes, fierce warriors who had ruled Egypt for centuries. The Mamelukes were known for their skill on horseback and their fearless nature in battle. But Napoleon, with his sharp military mind, devised a strategy to counter their attacks. Napoleon formed his troops into squares, a defensive formation that allowed them to withstand the cavalry charges of the Mamelukes. The French soldiers, armed with rifles and cannons, held their ground as the Mamelukes charged again and again. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and the cries of men and horses. The battle was intense, but Napoleon's strategy worked. The Mamelukes, unable to break the French lines, were forced to retreat. It was a hard-fought victory, but it gave Napoleon and his men a sense of confidence in this unfamiliar land. However, the challenges of the Egyptian campaign were far from over. As the French army moved closer to Cairo, they encountered more resistance. The Battle of the Pyramids was the most significant clash of the campaign. Napoleon, always aware of the power of symbols, positioned his troops with the pyramids in the background. "Soldiers," he told them, 40 centuries of history look down upon you." It was a powerful reminder of the importance of their mission. The battle itself was fierce. The Mamelukes, once again, charged at the French lines, but Napoleon's tactics proved superior. The French squares held firm, and the Mamelukes were eventually defeated. The victory allowed Napoleon to take Cairo, the heart of Egypt, and to establish French control over much of the country. It seemed for a moment that Napoleon's dream of building an empire in the East was within reach. But as the French settled into their new positions, the difficulties of occupying Egypt became apparent. The local population, though initially welcoming, grew increasingly resentful of the French presence. The heat, the desert, and the unfamiliar culture took their toll on the soldiers, who were far from home and struggling with disease and fatigue. The Nile, which had seemed so promising, became a source of frustration as the French found it difficult to navigate and control. One of the most significant setbacks of the campaign came at sea. The British Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, had been tracking the French fleet since they left France. In the Battle of the Nile, Nelson's forces caught the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. The battle was a disaster for the French. Nelson's ships attacked with precision, and within hours, most of the French fleet was destroyed or captured. Napoleon and his army were now stranded in Egypt, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. The loss of the fleet was a severe blow to Napoleon's plans. Without control of the sea, the French presence in Egypt became increasingly precarious. Napoleon, however, refused to give up. He continued to push forward, trying to consolidate French control and to build alliances with local leaders. He also turned his attention to exploring Egypt's ancient culture, commissioning scholars and scientists to study the country's history and to uncover its secrets. The French campaign in Egypt was as much about discovery as it was about conquest. But despite these efforts, the situation in Egypt grew more desperate. The French army, weakened by disease and constant skirmishes, struggled to maintain its hold on the country. Meanwhile, back in France, the political situation was changing. Napoleon received word that the government in Paris was in turmoil, and that his presence was needed to restore order. Realizing that his dream of an Eastern Empire was slipping away, Napoleon made the difficult decision to leave Egypt. In August 1799, he secretly departed for France, leaving his army behind under the command of General Kleber. It was a bitter end to what had begun as a grand adventure. Napoleon had sought to conquer a land rich in history and resources, but the harsh realities of the campaign had proven too much even for him. As Napoleon sailed back to France, he reflected on the lessons of the Egyptian campaign. It had been a time of both triumph and failure, a reminder that even the greatest ambitions must face the test of reality. The ancient land of Egypt, with its pyramids and deserts, had shown Napoleon the limits of power and the challenges of ruling far from home. The Egyptian adventure was a turning point in Napoleon's life. It tested his leadership, his resilience, and his vision. It was a campaign filled with drama and danger, with moments of victory and defeat. For the soldiers who had followed Napoleon into the desert, it was an experience they would never forget. a journey into the unknown that had revealed both the glory and the harshness of conquest. As Napoleon returned to France, he knew that his destiny lay not in the sands of Egypt, but in the heart of Europe. The lessons he had learned in the desert would stay with him as he continued his rise to power. The Egyptian campaign had been a bold gamble, one that had ended in failure, but it had also shown Napoleon that even in defeat, there were lessons to be learned and new paths to be forged. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Napoleon Bonaparte here on WooEnglish. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and comment. Your feedback means a lot to us and helps us bring you more inspiring content. Chapter 7. The Road to Power. The year was 1799, and France was in chaos. The country, which had been through years of revolution, was now facing a new wave of instability. The government, known as the Directory, was weak and unpopular. Corruption was widespread, and the people were growing tired of constant war and economic hardship. It was a time of uncertainty and fear, and into this storm, Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt, determined to change the course of history. Napoleon had left Egypt secretly, abandoning his army in the desert, but his return to France was anything but quiet. He was greeted as a hero, a general who had won great victories for France, but Napoleon had more than military glory on his mind. He saw an opportunity to seize power and bring order to the chaos that surrounded him. The boldness of his ambition was matched only by the risk involved, for failure would mean not just the end of his career, but possibly his life. As soon as Napoleon arrived in Paris, he began to gather allies. He knew that to succeed, he would need the support of key figures in the government, the military, and society. Among his supporters were his brother Lucien, who was a powerful politician, and Talleyrand, a skilled diplomat. They, along with a few others, formed a secret plan to overthrow the Directory and install Napoleon as the leader of France. The plan was bold and dangerous. It would require perfect timing and careful execution. On the morning of November 9th, 1799, the first step of the coup began. The members of the Directory were summoned to a meeting where they were told that there was a threat of a Jacobin uprising, a potential revolt by radical revolutionaries. Napoleon, dressed in his military uniform, appeared before them, playing the role of the loyal general who was ready to protect the Republic. But his true intentions were far from loyal. Napoleon's presence was commanding. He spoke with authority, and his reputation as a brilliant general gave his words weight. He convinced the members of the Directory to transfer power to him temporarily, so he could deal with the supposed threat. But this was just the beginning of his plan. The next day, November 10, known as 18, Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon made his move. He arrived at the Council of 500, the legislative body that held the power to approve or reject the new government. The council was meeting in the Château de Saint-Cloud, just outside Paris. It was a cold, tense day, and the atmosphere was filled with suspicion and fear. As Napoleon entered the council chamber, he was met with hostility. The members of the council were not easily fooled. They saw through his plan and began to shout accusations of tyranny and betrayal. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Napoleon, who had hoped to intimidate the council into submission, found himself in a dangerous position. The members of the council were calling for his arrest, and the room was in chaos. For a moment, it seemed that the coup might fail. Napoleon, usually so confident, was visibly shaken. But then his brother Lucien, who was president of the council, took control. He declared that the general was under threat from violent revolutionaries within the council and ordered the soldiers outside to enter the chamber. The soldiers, loyal to Napoleon, stormed into the room with their bayonets ready. The sight of armed men silenced the council members. Lucien then took the drastic step of dissolving the council, declaring that it was no longer capable of governing France. With the council dispersed, there was no one left to oppose Napoleon. Outside, in the courtyards of Saint-Cloud, Napoleon addressed his troops. He spoke of saving the Republic, of protecting France from chaos. His words were powerful, and his soldiers cheered him on. Napoleon's ability to inspire loyalty in his men was one of his greatest strengths, and it was on full display that day. With the government in disarray, Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate his power. He declared the end of the Directory and the creation of a new government, the Consulate. The new government would be led by 3 consuls, but it was clear to everyone that Napoleon was the true leader. Within days, he had become the first consul, effectively placing all the power in his hands. The coup of 18 Brumaire was a turning point in French history. In a matter of days, Napoleon had transformed himself from a military hero to the ruler of France. The speed and decisiveness of his actions stunned both his supporters and his enemies. He had taken a country on the brink of collapse and, with a bold and risky maneuver, had placed himself at the head of it. But the road to power was not without its challenges. Napoleon knew that his position was still fragile. The people of France were weary of leaders who promised much but delivered little. They had seen too many betrayals, too much bloodshed. Napoleon needed to prove that he was different, that he could bring stability and prosperity to a country that had known little of either for years. Napoleon moved quickly to address the problems facing France. He reformed the government, making it more efficient and less corrupt. He stabilized the economy, introducing new financial policies that helped to end the inflation that had plagued the country. He also began to rebuild the French army, preparing it for the wars that he knew were coming. But more than these practical measures, Napoleon understood the importance of symbolism. He presented himself as a man of the people, a leader who would protect the gains of the revolution while restoring order to France. He was careful to maintain the appearance of republicanism, even as he concentrated power in his own hands. The French people, exhausted by years of turmoil, were ready to believe in a leader who promised to bring peace and stability. As Napoleon solidified his power, he also began to look beyond France's borders. He dreamed of an empire that would stretch across Europe, of a France that would be the most powerful nation in the world. The coup of 18. Brumaire had given him the opportunity to pursue these dreams, and he was determined not to waste it. The coup that brought Napoleon to power was a masterful blend of military strategy, political maneuvering, and sheer audacity. It was a moment when the fate of France hung in the balance, and Napoleon's actions shaped the course of history. The risk was enormous, but so was the reward. In the space of a few days, Napoleon had gone from being a general in the French army to the most powerful man in France. For Napoleon, the road to power was not just about ambition, it was about destiny. He believed that he was chosen to lead France, to bring order out of chaos, and to guide the country to greatness. But he also knew that power was a double-edged sword. It brought with it not just the ability to shape the future, but the responsibility to live up to the expectations of an entire nation. As he looked out over Paris from his new position as first consul, Napoleon knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for the challenge. He had seized power with boldness and skill, and now he would have to keep it. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte was far from over. It was only just beginning. The man who had risen from humble beginnings in Corsica to rule France was about to embark on the most ambitious chapter of his life, one that would change the world forever. Chapter 8. The Coronation. The year was 1804, and France was at a crossroads. After years of revolution, war, and political upheaval, the country had finally found a measure of stability under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte. As first consul, Napoleon had brought order to the chaos, and now he was ready to take the next step, one that would change the course of history. On December 2nd, 1804, in the grand setting of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. The day of the coronation dawned cold and clear. Paris, the heart of the French Empire, was alive with anticipation. Crowds lined the streets, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had risen from a modest background in Corsica to become the ruler of France. The people, many of whom had lived through the dark days of the Revolution, were hopeful that this ceremony would mark the beginning of a new era, a time of peace, prosperity, and glory. As the morning light filtered through the mist, Napoleon prepared for the ceremony. He knew that this was not just a personal triumph, but a moment of great symbolic importance. The coronation was designed to showcase not only his power, but also the grandeur of the French Empire. Every detail had been carefully planned, from the lavish decorations in Notre Dame to the elaborate robes he would wear. This was a day to impress both the people of France and the monarchs of Europe, who would be watching closely. Notre Dame Cathedral, with its soaring arches and stained glass windows, was the perfect setting for such a historic event. The interior had been transformed for the occasion, draped in rich fabrics and adorned with golden decorations. The altar was surrounded by the symbols of imperial power, the scepter, the sword, and the globe, each representing a different aspect of Napoleon's rule. The atmosphere inside the cathedral was one of awe and reverence, a fitting backdrop for the ceremony that was about to take place. As the hour approached, the sound of trumpets filled the air, signaling the arrival of the dignitaries who would witness the coronation. Among them were members of the French nobility, foreign ambassadors, and representatives of the church. They took their places, each according to rank and title, their faces a mix of curiosity and solemnity. This was a moment of great significance, and everyone present understood the weight of what was about to happen. Then, at last, Napoleon himself appeared. He was dressed in robes of crimson velvet, lined with ermine and embroidered with golden bees, an ancient symbol of immortality and resurrection that he had chosen as his personal emblem. On his head, he wore a laurel wreath, echoing the crowns of the Roman emperors he so admired. Napoleon's presence was commanding, and as he walked down the aisle of the cathedral, all eyes were on him. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of history in the making. Following behind him was Josephine, his wife, who would soon be crowned empress. She was dressed in a gown of white silk, also adorned with golden embroidery. Her expression was serene, but beneath her calm exterior, she felt the weight of the moment. For Josephine, this was not just a day of celebration. It was also a day of immense responsibility. As empress, she would be expected to support Napoleon in his role as ruler and to help solidify the image of the new imperial family. As they reached the altar, Napoleon and Josephine knelt before Pope Pius VII, who had been invited to bless the coronation. The Pope's presence was a reminder of the delicate balance Napoleon had to maintain between his power and the authority of the Church. But in a move that surprised many, Napoleon did not wait for the Pope to place the crown on his head. Instead, he took the crown himself and, with deliberate and measured movements, placed it on his own head. It was a powerful gesture, one that symbolized his belief that his authority came not from the Church or the people, but from his own achievements and strength. The crown was made of gold, studded with jewels, and fashioned in the style of the ancient Roman emperors. As it rested on his head, Napoleon felt the full weight of his new title, Emperor of the French. It was a title that carried with it not only great power, but also great responsibility. He was now more than just a military leader or a political figure. He was the embodiment of the French state, the man who would guide his nation into a new era. The ceremony continued with the crowning of Josephine. Napoleon, turning to his wife, gently placed a smaller crown on her head. The moment was intimate, almost tender, yet it was also full of meaning. By crowning Josephine, Napoleon was not just honoring her, he was also solidifying the legitimacy of his rule. Together, they were the new face of the French Empire, a symbol of the unity and strength that Napoleon wanted to project to the world. As the ceremony drew to a close, the assembled guests rose to their feet. The cathedral echoed with the sound of music, as choirs sang hymns of praise, and the organ filled the vast space with a triumphant melody. It was a moment of grandeur and majesty, one that would be remembered for generations to come. Outside, the cannons of Paris fired in salute, their thunderous roar announcing to the world that France had a new emperor. Napoleon's coronation was more than just a political event. It was a carefully crafted display of power and ambition. Through this grand ceremony, he sent a clear message to the people of France and to the rest of Europe. He was not just a man of war, but a ruler who had the vision and the determination to lead his country into a new age. The symbolism of the event was unmistakable. Napoleon saw himself as a modern-day Caesar, a leader who would restore the glory of the empire and bring stability to a continent that had been ravaged by years of conflict. But beneath the pomp and circumstance of the coronation, there was also a sense of tension. Napoleon's rise to power had been rapid and, in some ways, unexpected. Many in Europe viewed him with suspicion, unsure of what his reign would bring. Even within France, there were those who questioned his decision to crown himself emperor, fearing that it marked a return to the absolute power of the old monarchy. Napoleon was aware of these doubts, but he was confident in his ability to overcome them. For him, the coronation was not an end, but the beginning of a new chapter in his quest for greatness. As Napoleon and Josephine left the cathedral, stepping out into the bright winter sunlight, they were greeted by the cheers of the crowd. The people of Paris, many of whom had suffered through the hardships of the Revolution, looked to Napoleon with hope. They saw in him a leader who could bring stability and prosperity, someone who could restore France's place as a great power in the world. The coronation was a day of triumph, but it was also a reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. Napoleon had achieved much, but there was still more to do. The path he had chosen was fraught with risks, and the responsibilities of empire would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But for now, as he stood before the people of Paris with the crown on his head, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power. The coronation was a moment of unparalleled significance in Napoleon's life. It was the culmination of years of ambition and effort, a testament to his belief in his own destiny. But it was also a moment of reflection, a recognition that with great power came great responsibility. As the cheers of the crowd echoed through the streets of Paris, Napoleon knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult. Yet he was ready to face it, confident in his vision and determined to leave his mark on history. And so, with the crown of the French Empire resting on his head, Napoleon Bonaparte began the next chapter of his extraordinary life. The road to power had been long and challenging, but the journey was far from over. The coronation was just the beginning of a new era, one that would see Napoleon rise even higher, but also face the greatest challenges of his life. Chapter 9. The Empire Expands. The year was 1805, and Napoleon Bonaparte, now crowned Emperor of the French, was at the peak of his power. The grand ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral had signaled the beginning of a new era, not just for France, but for all of Europe. Napoleon was determined to expand his empire, to bring the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, to the far corners of the continent. But this ambition would come at a great cost, both to France and to Napoleon himself. Napoleon's first move was to strengthen his control over Europe. He knew that France, though powerful, could not stand alone against the combined forces of the other European powers. To secure his position, he formed alliances with some countries while preparing to confront others. His strategy was both diplomatic and military, using persuasion where possible and force where necessary. One of the first major battles of this new phase in Napoleon's career was the Battle of Austerlitz in December 1805. It was here that Napoleon's strategic genius truly shone. The battle took place in the heart of Europe, in what is now the Czech Republic, and it pitted Napoleon's army against the combined forces of Austria and Russia. The enemy forces outnumbered Napoleon's, but he had a plan that would turn the tide in his favor. The morning of the battle was cold and misty. Napoleon's soldiers, though tired from the long march, were ready to fight. They trusted their leader, who had led them to victory so many times before. Napoleon himself was calm and confident, moving among his troops and giving orders with precision. He had carefully studied the terrain and the enemy's positions, and he knew exactly how he would win. Napoleon deliberately left one flank of his army weaker, luring the Austrians and Russians into a trap. As they attacked what they thought was a vulnerable point, Napoleon unleashed his reserves, cutting off their advance and surrounding them. The enemy, caught by surprise, was thrown into chaos. The sun broke through the mist at the height of the battle, and it seemed as though even nature was on Napoleon's side. By the end of the day, the French had won a decisive victory, and Austerlitz became known as one of Napoleon's greatest triumphs. But with every victory came new challenges. As Napoleon's empire expanded, so did the resistance against him. The countries of Europe, alarmed by France's growing power, began to form coalitions to stop him. Napoleon found himself constantly at war, moving from one battlefield to the next, always seeking to stay one step ahead of his enemies. The Battle of Jena Auerstedt in 1806 was another example of Napoleon's military brilliance. This time, he faced the Prussian army, one of the most formidable in Europe. The Prussians were confident, believing that they could defeat Napoleon and end his ambitions. But once again, Napoleon's tactics proved superior. He divided his forces, striking at the Prussians from multiple directions and overwhelming them. The victory was swift and complete, and it left Prussia at the mercy of France. Napoleon's success on the battlefield was matched by his efforts to reorganize Europe politically. He redrew the map of the continent, creating new kingdoms and placing his relatives and loyal followers on their thrones. His brother Joseph became King of Naples and later King of Spain, while other family members were given control of territories across Europe. Napoleon believed that by surrounding himself with loyal rulers, he could secure his empire and spread the ideals of the revolution. But as Napoleon's power grew, so did the resentment against him. The people of the countries he conquered often saw the French not as liberators, but as occupiers. In Spain, for example, Napoleon's decision to place his brother on the throne sparked a fierce resistance. The Spanish people, joined by British forces, waged a brutal guerrilla war against the French, a conflict that would drag on for years and weaken Napoleon's hold on the peninsula. Napoleon's expansionist ambitions also led to a growing sense of unease within France itself. The wars were costly, both in terms of money and lives. The French people, who had once seen Napoleon as a hero, began to question the endless campaigns and the sacrifices they were forced to make. But Napoleon was relentless. He believed that his destiny was to create a lasting empire, one that would dominate Europe and bring peace through strength. The year 1812 marked the height of Napoleon's empire, but it also signaled the beginning of his downfall. Determined to force Russia back into his alliance, Napoleon launched his most ambitious campaign yet, a massive invasion of Russia. He gathered an army of over 600,000 men, the largest force ever assembled in Europe, and marched eastward, confident of victory. But the Russian campaign would prove to be a disaster. The Russian army, instead of meeting Napoleon in a decisive battle, retreated deeper into their vast country, drawing the French further and further from their supply lines. The Russians employed a scorched earth policy, burning their own villages and fields to deny the French any resources. As the French army advanced, they found nothing but empty, desolate land. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found the city abandoned and burning. The Russians had set fire to their own capital rather than let it fall into French hands. With winter approaching and no clear victory in sight, Napoleon made the difficult decision to retreat. The journey back was harrowing. The brutal Russian winter, combined with constant attacks by Russian forces, decimated Napoleon's army. By the time they crossed the border back into Poland, only a fraction of the original force remained. The failure of the Russian campaign shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. His enemies, sensing weakness, formed a new coalition against him. In 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced a coalition of Russian, Austrian, Prussian, and Swedish forces. The battle was one of the largest and bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars. Despite fighting bravely, the French were outnumbered and eventually defeated. Napoleon was forced to retreat once again, his empire now crumbling around him. Back in France, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The wars had drained the country's resources, and the people were weary of the endless conflict. In 1814, as coalition forces closed in on Paris, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. He was exiled to the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean island where he would live under the watchful eye of his enemies. But even in exile, Napoleon's mind was restless. He dreamed of returning to power, of restoring his empire. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once ruled over most of Europe, was not yet over. But the dramatic expansion of his empire, built on the strength of his military genius and the ideals of the French Revolution, had come at a great cost. The victories that had once seemed so glorious now cast long shadows, hinting at the challenges and the ultimate downfall that lay ahead. The expansion of Napoleon's empire was a period of great drama and change in European history. It was a time of triumphs and betrayals, of battles won and lost, of alliances formed and broken. Napoleon's ambition knew no bounds, and his actions reshaped the continent. But the very forces that drove him to greatness also sowed the seeds of his eventual defeat. As the French Empire reached its zenith, the cracks began to show, and the path that had once seemed so clear now led into an uncertain and perilous future. Chapter 10. The Russian Disaster. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte embarked on one of the most ambitious military campaigns of his career, the invasion of Russia. It was a bold and risky move, driven by Napoleon's desire to force Tsar Alexander IV back into an alliance with France. At the time, Napoleon's empire stretched across much of Europe, and he believed that by defeating Russia, he could secure his dominance over the continent. But what began as a quest for power would soon turn into one of the greatest disasters in military history. Napoleon assembled a massive army for the campaign, known as the Grande Armée. It was the largest force ever put together in Europe, with over 600,000 soldiers from across the empire. They came from France, Italy, Germany, and other lands under Napoleon's control. The soldiers were well trained and experienced, and they marched with confidence, believing in their leader's invincibility. The French emperor had never lost a major battle, and his troops were ready to follow him anywhere. The invasion began in June 1812. As the Grande Armée crossed the border into Russia, they were met with little resistance. The Russian army, instead of confronting Napoleon directly, retreated deeper into their vast country. They used a strategy of scorched earth, burning villages, crops, and anything that might be useful to the French. As the French soldiers advanced, they found themselves marching through a desolate landscape, with no food, no shelter, and no sign of the enemy. At first, Napoleon remained confident. He believed that the Russians would be forced to fight eventually, and he expected a quick and decisive victory. But as the weeks passed, the situation grew more difficult. The summer heat was intense, and the soldiers suffered from thirst and exhaustion. The long marches through endless plains began to take their toll. Discipline weakened, and morale started to decline. Yet Napoleon pressed on, determined to reach Moscow, the heart of Russia. In September, after months of marching, the Grande Armée finally reached the outskirts of Moscow. The city, with its golden domes and grand palaces, seemed within their grasp. But when the French entered Moscow, they found it almost entirely abandoned. The Russian army had once again retreated, leaving behind a city that was eerily quiet. As night fell, fires began to break out across Moscow. The Russians had set their own capital ablaze rather than let it fall into Napoleon's hands. The sight of Moscow in flames was both shocking and devastating for Napoleon and his men. The city they had marched so far to capture was now a burning ruin. With winter approaching and no victory in sight, Napoleon faced a difficult decision. He had hoped to force Tsar Alexander to surrender, but now it was clear that the Russians had no intention of giving up. Staying in Moscow was impossible, and with supplies running low, there was only one option left: retreat. The retreat from Moscow was a nightmare. As the Grande Armée began its long journey back to France, the Russian winter set in with full force. Temperatures dropped to well below freezing, and the soldiers, already weakened by hunger and exhaustion, were ill-prepared for the harsh conditions. Snow and ice covered the ground, making it difficult to march. The wind cut through their thin uniforms, and many soldiers froze to death as they struggled to keep moving. The retreat turned into a desperate fight for survival. The soldiers, once proud and disciplined, were now reduced to a broken and starving mass. They had to abandon their cannons, wagons, and even their wounded comrades, leaving them behind in the snow. The Russian army, along with bands of Cossacks, harassed the retreating French at every turn. They attacked from the shadows, striking quickly and then disappearing into the wilderness. The French soldiers, already demoralized, had little strength left to defend themselves. As the days dragged on, the horrors of the retreat deepened. Food was scarce, and the soldiers were forced to eat whatever they could find: horses, dogs, even tree bark. Disease spread rapidly through the ranks, and many men died from typhus, dysentery, and frostbite. Those who fell behind were left to die in the snow, their bodies marking the path of the retreat. The Grande Armée, once the mightiest force in Europe, was now a shadow of its former self. Napoleon himself was deeply affected by the disaster. He had always been a leader who inspired his men with his courage and determination, but now he was faced with the stark reality of his failure. He rode among his troops, trying to encourage them, but even he could not deny the despair that had taken hold. The once unstoppable emperor now found himself retreating, his dreams of conquest shattered by the unforgiving Russian winter. The final blow came at the crossing of the Berezina River in late November. The French army, trying to escape the pursuing Russians, needed to cross the icy river to reach safety. But the crossing turned into a chaotic and bloody battle. The French engineers struggled to build makeshift bridges, while the Russian forces closed in on all sides. Thousands of soldiers and civilians were trapped on the wrong side of the river, and many drowned or were killed in the desperate attempt to cross. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée reached the other side of the Berezina, the once great force had been reduced to fewer than 30,000 men. Napoleon, realizing that his presence was needed in Paris to prevent his enemies from taking advantage of the disaster, left his army and returned to France. The soldiers who survived the retreat limped back across Europe, their spirits broken, their bodies scarred by the horrors they had endured. The Russian campaign was a turning point in Napoleon's fortunes. It marked the beginning of the end for the French Empire. The invasion, which had begun with such confidence and ambition, ended in catastrophe. The loss of so many men and the failure to defeat Russia weakened Napoleon's position both at home and abroad. His enemies, sensing his vulnerability, began to rally against him, forming new coalitions to bring down the emperor who had once seemed invincible. The Russian disaster also had a profound impact on Napoleon himself. He had always believed in his own destiny, in his ability to shape the future through sheer force of will. But the campaign showed him that even he could not control everything. The harsh realities of war, the brutal power of nature, and the determination of his enemies had brought him to the brink of ruin. The man who had once conquered much of Europe now faced the challenge of holding on to what remained. As Napoleon returned to Paris, he knew that his empire was in jeopardy. The Russian campaign had exposed the limits of his power and the dangers of overreaching ambition. The road ahead would be difficult, and the battles to come would be fought not just on the battlefield, but also within the halls of power. The disaster in Russia had changed everything, and Napoleon would have to find a way to recover from this devastating blow. The story of the Russian campaign is a story of hubris, of the dangers of believing that victory is always within reach. It is a story of human endurance, of the soldiers who fought and died in the frozen wilderness, and of a leader who, for the first time, faced the consequences of his own ambition. The road to Russia had led Napoleon to disaster, and the road back to Paris would be filled with even greater challenges. The empire that had once seemed unbreakable was now beginning to crumble, and the world would soon witness the fall of the man who had once ruled over it. Chapter 11. The Fall of an Emperor. In 1814, Europe was a continent on edge. For years, Napoleon Bonaparte had been the master of Europe, his armies sweeping across the lands, conquering and reshaping nations. But now, the tide was turning against him. The once unstoppable emperor was facing the greatest challenge of his life as the combined forces of Europe united to bring him down. After the disastrous Russian campaign in 1812, Napoleon's empire was weakened. The Grande Armée, which had once been the pride of France, was now a shadow of its former self. Tens of thousands of soldiers had perished in the frozen wastes of Russia, and those who survived were broken in body and spirit. News of the defeat spread quickly across Europe, emboldening Napoleon's enemies to rise against him. In 1813, the coalition of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden formed the Sixth Coalition, determined to end Napoleon's reign once and for all. Napoleon, ever the strategist, was not one to give up easily. Despite his losses, he quickly gathered a new army and prepared to face his enemies. But this time, the odds were not in his favor. The decisive confrontation came in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations. It was the largest battle in European history up to that point, involving more than 500,000 soldiers. Napoleon's forces, though still formidable, were outnumbered by the combined armies of the coalition. For 4 days, the battle raged, with soldiers fighting fiercely in the fields, villages, and rivers around Leipzig. Napoleon, directing his troops with his usual skill, managed to hold his ground for much of the battle. But as the coalition forces pressed harder, the French lines began to crumble. One by one, Napoleon's allies abandoned him. The betrayal was devastating. The Bavarians, the Saxons, and other German states that had once fought alongside him now turned against him, joining the coalition in the fight to end his rule. The final blow came when the bridge over the Elster River, Napoleon's only escape route, was destroyed by mistake. Trapped and surrounded, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. His army, exhausted and demoralized, fled from the battlefield in disarray. The defeat at Leipzig was a turning point. Napoleon's empire was now collapsing around him, and his enemies were closing in. As the coalition forces advanced towards France, Napoleon refused to give up. He still believed that he could turn the tide, that he could rally his people and defeat the invaders. In early 1814, he launched a series of lightning-fast campaigns known as the 6 Days Campaign, where he won several battles against the coalition forces. But these victories were fleeting. The coalition armies were too strong, too numerous, and they continued their march towards Paris. In March 1814, the inevitable happened. The coalition forces entered Paris, the heart of Napoleon's empire. The city, once filled with the cheers of victory and celebration, was now silent and fearful. The people of Paris knew that the end was near. Napoleon, realizing that he could not save his capital, rushed back from the front lines to defend it. But it was too late. On April 6, 1814, under immense pressure from his marshals and facing the overwhelming power of the coalition, Napoleon made the painful decision to abdicate the throne. It was a moment of deep humiliation for the man who had once ruled over much of Europe. Napoleon, who had always believed in his destiny to lead and to conquer, was now forced to confront the reality of his defeat. The terms of his abdication were harsh, but not without mercy. Napoleon was allowed to retain the title of emperor, but his empire was no more. He was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, where he would live out his days under the watchful eye of his captors. For Napoleon, who had once commanded armies and ruled over nations, the island of Elba was both a prison and a symbol of his fall from power. As Napoleon sailed to Elba, he reflected on the events that had led to his downfall. The battles, the betrayals, the moments of glory, and the moments of despair. All of these now seemed like distant memories. The man who had once stood at the height of power was now alone, with only his thoughts for company. On Elba, Napoleon tried to maintain some semblance of authority. He took charge of the small island, organizing its government, improving its infrastructure, and even forming a modest army. But despite his efforts, it was clear that his days of empire building were over. The island, with its narrow streets and rocky hills, was a far cry from the grand palaces and bustling cities of Europe that he had once ruled. Yet even in exile, Napoleon's mind was restless. He could not accept that his story was over. The flame of ambition still burned within him, and he began to plot his return. He received reports from France, where the Bourbon monarchy had been restored under King Louis XVI. The people of France, who had once embraced the revolution and then Napoleon's rule, were now growing disillusioned with the return of the old regime. Napoleon saw an opportunity. He believed that he could still reclaim his throne, that the people of France would rise up and support him once more. In March 1815, less than a year after his abdication, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France. His arrival sparked what would become known as the 100 Days, a brief and dramatic period in which Napoleon would once again seize power. As Napoleon marched towards Paris, thousands of soldiers and citizens flocked to his side. The king fled, and Napoleon once again entered the capital as a hero. But the triumph was short-lived. The coalition powers, shocked by his return, quickly mobilized their forces to crush him once and for all. The final confrontation came in June 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. This time, Napoleon faced the combined forces of the British, led by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians, under General Blücher. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with both sides fighting desperately for victory. But as the day wore on, it became clear that Napoleon's forces were outmatched. The arrival of the Prussian army sealed his fate. By evening, the battle was lost, and Napoleon's dreams of reclaiming his empire were shattered. After Waterloo, there would be no more comebacks. Napoleon was captured and sent into exile once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. There, far from the world he had once dominated, Napoleon would spend the remaining years of his life reflecting on his rise and fall. The fall of Napoleon was not just the end of a man's ambition. It was the end of an era. His reign had brought both glory and suffering to Europe, and his legacy would be debated for generations to come. Napoleon had pushed the limits of what one man could achieve, but in the end, he was forced to confront the reality that even the greatest empires can fall. As Napoleon spent his final days on St. Helena, he was surrounded by memories of his past, the battles he had won, the empires he had built, and the power he had once held. But now, there was nothing left but the vast ocean and the knowledge that his time had passed. The emperor, who had once dreamed of ruling the world, was now a prisoner of his own ambitions. The story of Napoleon's fall is a story of human limits, of how even the most powerful can be brought down by the forces of history. It is a reminder that glory and power are fleeting, and that in the end, we all must face the consequences of our actions. For Napoleon, the journey from emperor to exile was a harsh and humbling lesson, one that would echo through the pages of history. Chapter 12. Exile and Legacy. The journey to St. Helena was long and somber. As the ship cut through the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, Napoleon Bonaparte, once the ruler of a vast empire, now found himself a prisoner, bound for a remote island thousands of miles from the world he had once dominated. St. Helena was a small, rocky island in the South Atlantic, far from Europe, far from the battles and cities where Napoleon's name had been spoken with fear and admiration. It was here that he would spend the final years of his life in exile, reflecting on the rise and fall of his extraordinary career. When Napoleon arrived on St. Helena in October 1815, he was met with a stark landscape. The island was isolated, with steep cliffs and a harsh, windy climate. There were no grand palaces, no bustling streets, no armies to command. It was a place of exile, chosen specifically for its remoteness, to ensure that Napoleon could never again escape or rally his supporters. The man who had once ruled over much of Europe was now confined to a small, distant island, with only a handful of loyal followers to keep him company. Napoleon was housed at Longwood House, a modest and damp residence on the island. The conditions were far from comfortable, and the climate was unforgiving. The days were long and monotonous, with little to do but walk the grounds, read, and think. The isolation weighed heavily on Napoleon, who had spent most of his life in the midst of action and excitement. Now he was forced to confront the silence and the solitude, to live with the memories of his past and the reality of his present. As the months turned into years, Napoleon's health began to decline. The harsh conditions on the island, combined with the stress of his situation, took a toll on his body. He suffered from stomach pains and other ailments, and the once vibrant leader became increasingly frail. But despite his physical decline, Napoleon's mind remained sharp. He spent hours each day reading and writing, reflecting on his life, his achievements, and his mistakes. In his writings, Napoleon often looked back on his rise to power, the battles he had fought, and the empires he had built. He recalled the victories that had made him a hero in the eyes of many, and the losses that had eventually led to his downfall. There were moments of pride as he remembered the glory of Austerlitz, the strategic brilliance that had defeated the armies of Europe time and time again. But there were also moments of regret as he thought about the lives lost in the pursuit of his ambitions, the wars that had ravaged Europe, and the alliances that had crumbled under the weight of his power. Napoleon also reflected on the nature of power itself. He had once believed that he could shape the world according to his will, that his destiny was to rule and to lead. But the events of the last few years had shown him the limits of that power. He had been defeated, not just by armies, but by the forces of history, by the will of other nations, and by his own overreaching ambitions. The realization was a bitter one, but it was also a moment of clarity. In the quiet of St. Helena, Napoleon began to understand that even the greatest leaders must face the consequences of their actions. Despite his regrets, Napoleon remained proud of what he had accomplished. He saw himself as a man who had tried to bring order to a chaotic world, to spread the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity across Europe. He believed that his legacy would endure, that history would remember him not just as a conqueror, but as a reformer, a leader who had changed the course of history. And in many ways, he was right. The Napoleonic Code, a set of laws he had introduced, continued to influence legal systems around the world. The map of Europe had been redrawn because of his actions, and the ideas of the revolution had spread far beyond France's borders. But there was also a darker side to Napoleon's legacy. The wars he had waged had caused immense suffering, leaving millions dead or wounded, and entire regions devastated. The empires he had built were held together by force, and when that force was no longer strong enough, they crumbled. Napoleon's ambition had brought him great power, but it had also led to his downfall and to the suffering of countless others. As the years passed, Napoleon's thoughts often turned to his family. He longed to see his son, whom he had named King of Rome, but who was now far away in Austria, living under the control of his enemies. He thought about his wife, Josephine, whom he had divorced in pursuit of political alliances, and about the friends and allies who had once stood by his side. The isolation of St. Helena made these thoughts even more poignant, as Napoleon realized that he would likely never see them again. In May 1821, Napoleon's health took a turn for the worse. The stomach pains that had plagued him for years became more severe, and it was clear that his time was running out. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once dreamed of ruling the world, died on the island of St. Helena. His final words were said to be, "France, the army, Josephine," a reminder of the things that had meant the most to him in life. Napoleon was buried on St. Helena, in a simple grave marked by a plain stone. There were no grand monuments, no crowds of mourners, just the wind and the sea, and the few loyal followers who had stayed with him until the end. But even in death, Napoleon's story was far from over. His legacy would continue to shape the world for generations to come. In the years following his death, Napoleon's image underwent a transformation. To some, he was a hero, a man who had brought glory to France and challenged the old order of Europe. To others, he was a tyrant, whose ambition had caused untold suffering. The debate over his legacy continues to this day, with historians and scholars offering different interpretations of his life and his impact on the world. What is certain, however, is that Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the most influential figures in history. His actions changed the course of nations, and his ideas helped shape the modern world. Whether seen as a hero or a villain, Napoleon's legacy is a complex one, filled with both triumph and tragedy. As we reflect on Napoleon's life, we are reminded of the power of ambition, the consequences of leadership, and the limits of human control. Napoleon's story is a testament to the heights that can be reached through determination and vision, but also a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching. In the end, Napoleon Bonaparte was a man who sought to shape the world, but who was ultimately shaped by it as well. The island of St. Helena, where Napoleon spent his final years, remains a symbol of his rise and fall. It is a place of solitude and reflection, where the echoes of his past can still be felt. And as we consider his legacy, we are left with a question that has no easy answer. What does it mean to be great? For Napoleon, greatness was a mixture of power, ambition, and vision. But it was also a reminder that even the greatest among us must face the consequences of their choices, and that history is the ultimate judge of our lives.